Good morning, everyone. I'm Deb Kidwell with the Midwestern Higher Education Compact, and I want to welcome you to today's Security Services webinar. We are going to be discussing ransomware trends, the evolution of the threat. A few reminders as we begin. The resources from this session will be available on MEC's website after the event. If you have questions during the webinar, you are welcome to submit those. We prefer that you put those in the question and answer box, but we will also be monitoring the regular chat box. We will make some time and take questions throughout the webinar, so feel free at any time to submit those in. At the end of the survey, the end of the webinar, we will also be sending out a post-event survey, and we really would appreciate your feedback. So I want to tell you a little bit about MEC as we get started. MEC is the Midwestern Higher Education Compact. We were legislatively created, and we serve the Midwest census region of 12 states. We're one of 4 regional higher education compacts. The other 3 are the New England Board of Higher Education, the Southern Regional Education Board, and the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education. Our technologies program at MEC includes a community of institutional volunteers offering advice and guidance to MEC, as well as a technology contracts portfolio designed to meet the community's needs. So about our MEC's technologies communities, we identify opportunities for contracts that will serve higher education needs. And one of the things that we did was identify a need in the area of cybersecurity. It was noted that we needed both contracts and education. So for this webinar series, we went and reached out to our partners and asked them to provide some educational information to the community. And so we're very excited to be able to do this with this webinar today through that partnership. Our MEC technology contracts, they are designed to sustain and advance affordable, high-quality educational opportunities through cost savings initiatives. Next slide, Mary. They're known and used by higher education, IT, and procurement offices. And as our role in higher education has grown, contracts are needed that might not traditionally have been considered technology. So you can learn more about our MEC contracts at mhec.org/contracts. As I mentioned, this is part of a webinar series, and this is our 3rd offering in the series. So on the slide that is presented, you can see the remaining series. You can also go to our events page and see some of the prior information. If you'd like to receive some reminders about these webinars, please be sure that you are subscribed to MEC Technologies newsletter, which can be found on our website at mec.org/subscribes. With that, I'm going to focus on today's webinar, which is presented in partnership with SecureWorks, a Dell company. With us today is Noel Reynolds. He is a security engineer for SecureWorks. Dell does hold a MEC contract that was awarded through a competitive process for a wide range of services, including security services. All public and private, not-for-profit higher education institutions within the MEC region and our compact partners regions are eligible to use this contract. If you have any questions about the contract, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of the MEC staff, and we'll be happy to help. Noel, with that, I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you so much. And let me just get this shared. And let me know if you can see my screen there. Give me 1 second. There we go. Everything good? Awesome. Cool. So first of all, thank you everyone for joining today. Again, my name is Noel Reynolds. I am a senior security engineer with SecureWorks. I have been in the technology space for well over 25 years and really sort of always focused on cybersecurity. One of the great parts about working at SecureWorks is we're wholly focused on that. And so, it gives me the ability to really focus on what I love. Today we're going to talk about ransomware. Hopefully you guys learned something today, some things that maybe we can take with us or use to kind of improve things overall after the fact. So we'll just get started. So I'm going to read this. I don't normally read slides, but this one I think is important. So hello, victim company redacted. We are the Conti Group. We want to inform you that your company's local network has been hacked and encrypted. We downloaded from your network more than 180 gigs of sensitive data, shared HR, shared accounting, corporate debt departments, you can see your page in our blog here, and then you have a link. Your page is hidden, but it will be published if you do not go to the negotiations. And if you were to power on your machine and see that message, that basically means that your organization has missed every opportunity to detect the threat of ransomware. And you're now in a situation where you're going to be negotiating with a criminal organization, likely based in Eastern Europe. And really, at this point, you have, you're going to have to do incident response. You're going to have to attempt to recover from this. And it's really potentially the worst day your organization is going to have. For some small, medium businesses, this can actually be an extinction event where, if they lose everything and they're unable to rebuild, it can be really brutal. And I'm not saying that to scare you. I'm saying that to really try to help you understand that this is something to be taken very, very seriously. I think one of the things that I like about talking about ransomware is the fact that it's one of the rare cybersecurity threats that has crossed over into mainstream understanding. And the reason for that is because we're seeing organizations hit on an almost daily basis. It's really important to understand, though, that this is something that you can prevent, and you can definitely detect early and avoid being hit by. But a lot of organizations don't. So from a SecureWorks perspective, just so you guys are aware, we've been in business for 22 years. I'm not trying to sell SecureWorks, but just to give you some background, we have a threat intelligence organization called the Counter Threat Unit. It's 100-ish PhD level researchers that are global. They're constantly studying the threat landscape and trying to understand, what threat actors are doing and help our customers by detecting those threats. We also do incident response. So when I talk about some of these slides, I'm not necessarily talking about a customer that is using SecureWorks products, but rather one that engages with us from an incident response perspective because they have been hit by ransomware and they need our help. From our perspective, obviously we want to help that customer, but one of the nice things is we're able to intake sort of any forensic telemetry that we see. We can learn how did the threat actor get into that environment? What did they do once they were in? And then we can use that to have better intelligence and collect data on that. But we do have customers that continue to get hit by this, or at least targeted by this. But I think it's fair to say right now that the landscape is shifting. It's shifting in a variety of different ways, and we'll talk about that as the slides go on. One of the ways is just the amount of noise that it's generating is getting maybe unwanted by the ransomware gangs, unwanted attention. But there are some other things as well. And again, we're always looking for ways to prevent and detect this threat. And just so I said it, I know if anyone has any questions throughout the presentation, I'm happy to stop and answer them. And we'll go on. So this is a threat that's impossible to ignore. If we look at 2021, we saw, there was the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack. In that case, what's called the OT network, or the network of the actual pipeline itself, was not hit, but rather it was the billing network that was shut down. We saw the meatpacker JBS. So the meatpacker, there's only 4 meatpackers in North America, and one of them was JBS. They were actually the largest. They were hit by a ransomware gang. That actually caused issues with food supply. It caused the price of beef to go up for a short period of time, and that was very impactful. And then, of course, Kaseya, probably a lot of people have heard of that. What was interesting about Kaseya is a platform that's used to deploy software within a customer environment. And so Kaseya was what we would call a supply chain hack, or where essentially Kaseya being hacked allowed the ransomware gang that did the work which was, I believe, Revel, to get in to a lot of other customers that they wouldn't have had access to otherwise. And they were also able to skip a lot of what we call the kill chain. And we'll see kind of what that looks like on a further slide. But it was kind of a unique attack. The one that's really interesting that's happened so far in 2022 is Kronos. And so for those of you who are or maybe not familiar with Kronos, Kronos is essentially a timekeeping application. Today, I remember back when I had a sort of an hourly job, I would clock in when I started that job, and I was clocking into a Kronos timekeeping machine or device. Now it's a cloud-based solution that they offer, which sometimes they'll have devices locally, what have you. But this had a tremendous impact, because this again is another sort of example of supply chain. So it took them over 2 months to recover from this. And during that period of time, their customers suffered from their customers of Kronos had their employee data leaked to the threat actor. And then the other thing that happened was those customers who were using Kronos had trouble paying their employees, which of course is going to cause a major concern. And you can see here just from the headline that included hospitals as well. So from a ransomware landscape perspective, we're seeing a lot of ransomware as a service operations, and the next slide is going to talk about what that specifically is. But just to kind of paint a picture, it's not just a small group that's doing these things. Typically, it is large groups that are multifaceted, and again, we'll look at what that is, that are doing this. And these are real business engagements that are happening. And there's been some actually very interesting things that have happened in the news in the last few days. Again, we'll talk about that. Active name and shame groups. So name and shame. So I think most of us are familiar with the idea that ransomware means you log onto your computer, your drives are encrypted in some fashion, or at least large portions of the data on your drive is encrypted, and you have to pay money and typically in the form of some kind of cryptocurrency, to get the decryption key so that you can get your data back. Name and shame is really like the idea that they're sort of going to hit you in three different ways. Way one would be the encryption of your local data, but prior to encrypting that data, a lot of times what they'll do is they'll exfiltrate it to some kind of like cloud storage, what have you, and they'll threaten to release it. They'll also just threaten to name you as you've been hacked, and of course there can be brand loss and things like that happen from that. Again, this is last year, 2021, 2,300 plus public victims, and we think that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are many organizations that don't report this, many that just pay the ransom because frankly that's the easiest path in some cases. That's certainly, but we think this is just a very small portion of what actually happened last year. And then the highest reported public ransomware that we saw was, I believe, the CNA Insurance Group. This was not specifically a SecureWorks customer, but it was reported in the media that they paid $40 million from a ransomware perspective to the group that hacked them. So again, I want to make it clear that this is not just a small group of people. This is a large criminal underground economy that is multifaceted and involves a lot of different organizations. And so, you may have a ransomware ecosystem like Conti, like Ryuk, like Revil or R-Evil, depending on how you want to say it. And within that group, you'll have groups that are responsible for developing the software. You'll have groups that are working to get initial access. So initial access broker, their whole job is to look on the internet either through broad scanning or maybe through just targeted attacks. Broad scanning is sort of, you're just scanning the internet looking for certain vulnerabilities. A lot of times those can be vulnerabilities that have been recently published. And so they'll get some proof of concept code and they'll scan the internet looking for endpoints that are vulnerable to whatever that initial access vector is. And when they find them, they'll sort of potentially get a foothold within that environment, or at least validate that they can get a foothold in that environment. And then they'll sell that back to the overall ransomware ecosystem or to a ransomware affiliate. You have ransomware as a service. So ransomware as a service is, you can essentially pay someone to ransomware an organization if you choose to. There are private groups that are doing this. But in general, we're seeing this sort of broader ecosystem. And then you have ransomware affiliates, which are, maybe I want to work with R-Evil. And so I want to use their software and their tooling, and I have to meet a certain set of requirements in order to do that. And so, but that gives me access to their tools, and then I have to abide by their rules. And when I say rules, I'm really, there's definitely some air quotes there, because some of these threat groups have, they'll say, hey, we don't attack hospitals. Hey, we don't attack, education. We don't attack, the energy grid, things like that. But what we've actually seen is they tend to be a lot more indiscriminate than that in practice. And it's really about where they think they can get, the easiest access. I also think it's important to differentiate between the ransomware criminals and what we would consider nation state actors. You have to understand that a nation state actor has an unlimited amount of time and practically an unlimited budget. And they tend to be a lot lower and slower and more targeted. I think it's really important to say, and one of the ladies who's on our threat intelligence group, the counter threat unit, her quote was, ransomware gangs are vultures, not eagles. And what that means is, I think we all imagine that, a very high speed, a very efficient, very, directed group. And certainly these gentlemen are smart, but at the same time, they're criminals, and they're really looking for the low-hanging fruit that they can attack, and so that they can move on to the next one, because everything that you see here is all about return on investment. They want to spend the least amount of time and generate the largest amount of budget. So from a real world impact perspective, again, when we look back at the Colonial Pipeline, this actually, by shutting down the pipeline for a period of time, this actually increased the price of gas. And so, we actually saw a rise. I mean, certainly not the gas prices we're seeing today, but it absolutely increased the price of gas over a short period of time within that. Now, again, this was sort of a departure from what we had seen prior, because in general, this would be considered an energy organization. And generally speaking, the ransomware gangs have avoided that, because what they're also not trying to do, and kind of what the impact of Colonial Pipeline was, is that they started to see that they were getting a lot more attention than they wanted. As a matter of fact, we saw the ransomware task force was created. We saw, there were different alerts that were being put out by CISA and other organizations. And so, Babuk, as an example, announced that they were closing their ransomware operation after an attack on the DC police. We saw the DarkSide gang decide to, say that they were going to retire. And I believe this was I think DarkSide was responsible for the Colonial Pipeline, and they wanted to, again, there was just too much heat from a law enforcement perspective. And so they wanted to get out of it. We see, in this one, we've got a group saying, due to the current situation in the US, we are making some adjustments. It's forbidden to work in certain countries. For those of you who follow Brian Krebs, one of the things that he recommended was to install a Russian keyboard on your Windows devices, because if that was detected by the ransomware software, they would target you. And you can see here they're saying, for violation of these rules, so this is for their affiliates, the account is deleted, so you no longer have access to it. See here, kind of something similar. In all these cases, they basically said that they were going to dial it back. They were very public in sort of the way that they did that, again, with one notable exception, which was REvil. REvil basically said, hey, we don't care, we're still going to go hard. But with this much heat on them, they essentially said, we're not going to do this anymore. And the reality is, a lot of times what they would do is just go underground for a short period of time, rebrand themselves, rebuild their organization, and then come back and continue to do ransomware attacks. We did have some wins, and I'm going to say again, I think wins can maybe be put in air quotes. As long as there is money to be had, we're going to see that this is going to continue. So one of the things that we saw was the Conti ransomware playbook was leaked, giving insight into their attacks, their tools, tactics, procedures. I mean, that was studied by every security organization to make sure that we were able to do detections. We saw the full source code for Babuk's ransomware was leaked on a Russian-speaking hacker forum. We've seen, so because of the fact that all this was going on, we saw that the US declared this a national security risk. And I think this was done under the Biden administration. The Trump administration was very good on this as well. I'm not taking any political position. I'm just saying that, both organizations have taken this very seriously, but it's now declared a national security risk, which is honestly, from the perspective of someone living in the United States, that's actually a very good thing, because it gives sort of the FBI and the NSA and the National Reconnaissance Office a little bit more freedom to operate and freedom to investigate these organizations. And we've certainly seen some wins. We have the Joint Cybersecurity Advisory, again, they're all working together to try to stop these different organizations. We see that when during some of the attacks, the FBI actually had the REvil decryption key, which is really critical, because they were able to work with organizations and get data decrypted without the organization having to pay. Of course, that doesn't stop. So just because you can decrypt the data, if the threat actor already exfiltrated your data, you may have backups. You may be able to decrypt it because you work with law enforcement, or you work with some organization that has the decryption key. But of course, you still run the risk of your data being leaked publicly, and that can be a big risk, and that can also be an incentive for people to pay. We also saw And I have a slide on Russia and Ukraine at the end of this presentation, but we did see that shortly before the war started in Russia, so you can see this headlines from the 14th of January, the REvil ransomware gang was being arrested in Russia, and I believe they arrested 14 different members of the gang. It was sort of a sign that maybe Russia was going to start cooperating more. Traditionally, they've sort of looked the other way in terms of the actors that are within their environment. As long as they don't target the Russian government or anything of a Russian interest, they're willing to let these people operate freely within their environment. But they did target at one point the REvil ransomware gang, and again, this was pre the war. And then just recently, I think this was actually last week, we saw that there was a REvil hacker that was in Poland who was extradited to the United States and arrested, I believe, in Texas. And so again, we are starting to see where law enforcement is targeting these organizations more holistically and really going after them in a way that is potentially having an impact. It doesn't change the fact that there is a large amount of money to be made here, and it's relatively easy. So from a client impact perspective, so all of this data is recent. It's from the second half of 2021. I believe it's in SecureWorks puts out a sort of a state of the threat landscape briefing that we put out. But we saw, there are a lot of different organizations targeting different verticals. One thing that I always shy customers away from the idea that there's no ransomware that specifically targets education. There might be groups that are more accustomed to looking at educational sources, but you see there's a lot of groups in manufacturing here. Typically, this is because manufacturing doesn't really have a lot of regulation it has to adhere to, where maybe some of the others, healthcare or oil and gas or financial organizations, they all have sort of frameworks for compliance that they're required to adhere to. Manufacturing tends to lag behind that a little bit, and a lot of times their core competencies aren't cybersecurity. Their core competencies are manufacturing, whatever the things are. So we see a lot of that targeting them. But I do caution you, the things that you need to do to protect yourself from ransomware are relatively universal, and there isn't something specific, some kind of specific software that targets one vertical versus another. So for the second half of 2021, we saw 41 different engagements. Now, engagements here, this is incident response engagements. So these are organizations that were compromised by ransomware. We went in and we helped them clean it up and help them out. The greatest impact that we saw for one of those customers was 766 servers and 3,000 workstations. Highest ransomware paid was $15 million, which is, of course, a lot of money. Shortest dwell time, average dwell time, and longest dwell time. These are all very interesting numbers because the shortest dwell time, Kaseya, just as an example, if you were a customer of the Kaseya organization who was hit by ransomware, and I know that SecureWorks had 4 different of our customers who were Kaseya customers as well, the actual dwell time for you as a customer was 2 days. The actual time that it took for the threat actor to get into Kaseya itself was significantly longer than that. But because of the fact that they were able to skip all the way to, hey, we've compromised a software deployment tool within a downstream customer environment, your dwell time was about 2 hours. Now, we did still detect that threat, but at the same time, they were much further ahead in what we would call the kill chain than a lot of other things. The average dwell time of 26 days has come down. Last year at this time, I think this number was 32 days. And 26 days it might seem like a long time, it might seem like a short time. For us, we actually see that as a very good number. 26 days is a lot of time to detect the types of things that threat actors do within the environment, which we're going to talk about in a couple slides here. But first, I just kind of wanted to show one on, how are they getting in, right? Because I think initial access is really, once the threat actor gets in, they can practically do anything. So what is the number one way that they're getting in today? And that's vulnerabilities in internet-facing devices. And again, a lot of times what you'll see is these vulnerabilities are things that, it'll get published by a vendor, they don't get patched. And so the threat actor is able to actually leverage that to get into an environment. But we also see, of course, stolen credentials is very popular. You can get that through a lot of different ways. Malicious emails has actually come down a little bit. But brute force attacking, that's something that's there. There are a variety of other ways, but for the most part, again, patching those internet-facing devices is actually, a very, very good thing to do. Stolen credentials, of course, can be mitigated by something like multi-factor authentication. So even if the threat actor gets the credentials for one of your users, they are unlikely, if it's implemented properly, to beat multi-factor authentication as well. So I think that's something to just note. So what does a ransomware attack look like? And what I'll say is, if you're familiar with what I would consider the real kill chain or the MITRE attack framework, MITRE is an organization that tracks vulnerabilities, and they have a framework for understanding how threat actors behave. This is an abbreviated version of this, but this, I think, does a good job of illustrating sort of point by point, how does the threat actor get in and what do they do once they are in. So, initial access, they get that. Then once they're into an environment, they're doing reconnaissance, they're looking around to see what they can find, enumerating your Active Directory environment, dumping credentials so that they can get further access, escalate their privileges, do things like that. At that point, again, they're also looking at that point for where is the valuable data, and these guys are really good at finding it. And once they get to that point, they're going to try to exfiltrate that data. They will then stage the tools that they need, or simultaneously they'll be staging the tools they need while they wait for the data to egress out of the environment. Once they stage those tools, typically using a domain controller to do so, or the Active Directory infrastructure to do so, that's when they'll actually deploy the ransomware. The ransomware can come in a variety of different forms, and at that point, that's actually when a lot of customers will actually identify the problem, because they log in and they see that horrible screen that we saw on the first slide, which says, hey, you're going to have to basically negotiate with essentially terrorists or criminals at this point. That's, and then again, at that point, that's where a customer has to negotiate. That's where, potentially they have to deal with whether their data is published online, potentially renegotiating, and these organizations are absolutely malevolent in the way and unrelenting in the way that they negotiate with you. I mean, they understand that they have, a variety of different ways to influence you. And so again, even if you are able to restore everything from a great backup, or if you are able to, just the brand recognition loss or the data being, deployed or sold to the highest bidder. And just so I said it, typically the way that works is they will post your data on a site and say, hey, we have all the data for this organization, and you will have the first right to purchase that from an auction perspective. And so if you're willing to pay the ransom, you get your data back or not. Something that doesn't always happen, but most of the time you will get your data back. But if you refuse to pay, they'll just auction it off to the highest bidder. And if that data leads to further compromise or potentially compromise of your users or your customers, they really don't care about that. They're just in it for the money. A lot of times also what they'll do is, if you pay, they're going to, they'll remove your data. They will give you the decryption keys, but they're going to leave your name published on their website saying like, hey, this was an organization that we compromised. And so again, this is kind of what it looks like from an attack perspective. Now, again, what I would say the good news is each of these phases, which is actually broken up into more phases than you see here, are opportunities for there to be detections. You can detect initial access. You can detect someone doing sort of what I would consider unusual reconnaissance within your environment. You can absolutely detect data exfiltration in a variety of different ways. The staging of those tools can be detected. And ransomware deployment, of course, can be detected. So there's a lot of opportunity here to not get to this point. And so how? So the most important thing is to have endpoint and network detection. And this really comes in two different forms. I think everyone's familiar with next-gen antivirus, but a true EDR or XDR tool, next-gen antivirus is, the way that I would describe it is, it's looking for, in almost all cases, known knowns or known bad behavior. Some of the anomaly detection that it will do, sometimes it's valuable, sometimes it's not. An EDR tool, though, which is an acronym for extended detection and response, is actually looking at everything that's happening on the endpoint. And in that way, it's much easier for it to pick out true anomalies. And then the other thing is, if you see anomalous behavior, even if it's later in the kill chain, you can go back and find, okay, where was my initial access vector? And that's so important to understand, because if you can close off the vector that the threat actor had for initial access, you're in a position where now you can stop them from getting back into your environment and potentially patch a hole in your security overall. It's so important to have that endpoint visibility. Really, in many ways, everything originates off of the endpoint. Network controls that's perimeter are phenomenal, but if someone is able to get by those network controls at the perimeter and get into your environment, a lot of times internally they can sort of move around unfettered. And if you have an EDR tool, that's a great way to detect them. Scanning and exploiting. They're looking for ways to, again, scan your environment and exploit any vulnerabilities. Some of them are known, some of them are unknown. But having what I would say, an always-on vulnerability scanning solution with, and also, taking it seriously and patching the vulnerabilities, which I absolutely understand, can be a monumental task with, the number of vulnerabilities we see on a week-to-week basis. But having that, I think what's important and what we've seen from, and I do not have my SecureWorks hat on at this moment, but what we've seen is, organizations do better when the vulnerability scanning solution is able to sort of contextualize the vulnerabilities in terms of what's most important in that customer environment. And there are a variety of tools that do that today. And I think that's very critical. And then again, multi-factor authentication to prevent things like credential abuse. It's fine if you don't want your credentials to be stolen, but if they are, and I've been involved in a variety of different scenarios where I've seen, a user, gets a fake email where they think it's something that is real, that came from the IT department or what have you. They try to log into it with their credentials, and then all of a sudden, the threat actor is trying to log into Office 365 or OneDrive or Dropbox or whatever it happens to be with those same credentials, and sure enough, they find out that they have access to those things. Having multi-factor authentication is just a wonderful way to prevent them from doing something malicious in your environment. The other things that are really critical, having good threat intelligence. Threat intelligence is an interesting thing because I think the challenge that you have a lot of times is there's a lot of organizations that sell threat intelligence. What is hard to do is to operationalize it. And so, first of all, you want to work with a reputable organization that has good threat intelligence. Certainly there are some open source tools that do that. A lot of the threat intelligence you can purchase actually takes into account a lot of what you can get from an open source perspective, but having good threat intelligence that's able to be operationalized is really critical. And Deb, I think you probably are going to tell me you have a question. And you're on mute right now. No problem.
There is a question in the question box, and the question is, how much of this applies to home computers?
So that's a great question. So typically, if the home computer is part of the organization's infrastructure, so if it's a home computer and it's truly a personal device, the most effective way to deal with that is to essentially educate your users the best that you can, which is always a challenge. I mean, typically the users are the weakest link, but the most important thing is to make sure that in the manner that they interact with your organization, you're giving them absolutely zero trust. You can't trust that they're not doing something malicious, or even someone in their household who is not necessarily aware of anything to do with computers. As an example, my son is 13 years old, and he's done things on if I give him access to my computer, he'll do things that I wouldn't want him to do. And so it's sort of an education process, but at the same time, from an organizational perspective, you must treat those devices with sort of zero trust. You can give folks access to the data, but typically the best way to do that is through some kind of a cloud environment that has the right controls around it. Hopefully, and if that didn't answer the question, I'm happy to answer any kind of follow-ons about that. Effectively instrumenting the environment. So this is another place where we're seeing I think everyone has seen that we've had a big shift from everything used to be on premises, in on-premises data centers. We certainly didn't have the remote workers that we have en masse, that we've had in the last 2 years. Instrumenting the environment, I think maybe used to be a little bit easier. And now, sort of the perimeter has shifted to where it's everywhere. And you really need to be able to understand what's happening within your environment. And the best way to do that is, what the tools that are being called XDR today are really, I think, the best way to do that. And what is meant normally by XDR, so we talked about EDR was extended detection and response. That's typically an endpoint technology. The idea behind XDR X is sort of there for anything, but it's extended detection and response is the acronym. And the idea is, you have security controls on your endpoints. You have security controls from a networking perspective, things like firewalls, IDS, IPS, maybe a web application firewall. And you also have your cloud environment, right? The perimeter is expanded. There are projects in potentially, for some organizations, they have projects going in Azure, AWS, and Google Cloud, maybe even, something like Oracle Cloud. And you need to have a tool that can take all of those environments and give you really a holistic view. Because, if a threat actor, as an example, were to get into your environment on an endpoint, and then go through the network to maybe an AWS environment, exfiltrate data from your AWS environment, and then send it back out. That's a situation where you need to have the right telemetry from all those different environments. And so, the XDR tools that are coming to market, I think, are the best way to do that, to really get that holistic view. And then the part that I can't, I wish I were even better able to talk about this, but having the right people, processes, and tools for response. And this is something that we see all too often, which is, an organization gets compromised and they really have no idea what to do. They've never prepared for it. They haven't planned for it. They haven't done a tabletop. They have paid a lot of money for security controls. I mean, we've worked with organizations that have, 36 different security controls in place from the endpoint to the cloud. And they never bothered to do a penetration test to validate that those controls were actually doing what they expected them to do. But absolutely drilling for this, planning for it. Look, we're one of many organizations that offers a ransomware preparedness seminar that we can do for you. But doing things like penetration tests, once you've graduated from, you're doing well in your penetration tests, maybe doing a red team test where, an organization takes the gloves off and really comes at you, can test your defenses, make sure that your blue team is up to speed. And depending on your size and what your concerns are, a purple team test where there's sort of a back and forth engagement between the red team and the blue team, and you're able to train kind of both of those organizations to respond in the right way. That's really critical. And I also want to emphasize that, when I talk about the right people to respond, I'm not just talking about the cybersecurity team or the IT team. I'm talking about from a leadership level, how are you going to react to that? And have you thought about that? And is everyone within your organization kind of on the same page? And that's where tabletops can be very helpful, because you can bring sort of disparate people into the room and really help them understand what their role will be if something like this were to happen. But again, the goal obviously, of course, is to always detect these things as early as possible. And again, I just want to emphasize, so this is the #1 threat that we see facing our customers. I think one of the funny things that we see in cybersecurity is everyone wants to talk about the Chinese nation state actors. They want to know about the most up-to-date AI attack that someone might be doing, and so they're concerned about these very, very high-speed, very technical things. The reality a lot of times, though, is just doing the basics, good patching, multi-factor authentication, making sure that you have the right visibility in your environment. This can really stop this kind of an attack. But this is the #1 threat facing our customers. And all too often, the manner in which the threat actor initially gets in is something that absolutely could have been prevented. And even after that, initial access doesn't mean you lost. Initial access means they got in. But what you do after the fact, or what controls you have in place after the fact, are just as important. And again, I want to emphasize this is something that can absolutely be stopped. It's indiscriminate and opportunistic. As like I said earlier, the quote from the wonderful lady in our CTU group. These guys are vultures, not eagles. They are not as you can absolutely stop this. So you by raising the cost, by doing some of those right things that we talked about, they'll go elsewhere. It is not as technically sophisticated as you might expect. Having those layered controls, the visibility, the tripwires in place, that can be very helpful. And again, even if you're paying for it and what have you, there's no silver bullet. I added a couple slides to this presentation specifically for this. So this is the top 20 recommendations that SecureWorks makes to our customers. And I believe Deb or Mary, correct me, these guys will get these slides after this if they want it. If not, take a screenshot. You guys are certainly able to do that.
Yes, still have access to it.
Awesome, thank you. So this is a list of the top 20 things that we recommend from doing this. And again, I would emphasize the ones that we talked about earlier, which is regular vulnerability scanning. Again, real-time vulnerability scanning is best. I see customers who will pay organizations to do a one-time vulnerability assessment. So an organization will come into your environment, they do a scan of vulnerabilities across your environment, you pay some amount of money for that, and you do that on a yearly basis. In many cases, a vulnerability scanning solution actually would be a lower cost, and you would be able to scan all the time, and that can really help you, I think. So I'm not going to go through all of these. Again, you guys will get the slides, but I think that this was an important one to share with you guys. These are the top 20 things we recommend. And then I think, and then this is I guess second to last slide here. So the Russia-Ukraine factor. So how's the war impacting this? So what's interesting is, again, we saw that slide where the REvil ransomware gang were getting arrested by the Russian FSB. FSB is their version of kind of the FBI. That really seems to have been done to maybe sort of soften the West's view of Russia. Obviously, that did not, that has failed based on what we've seen just from a media perspective, et cetera. Clearly, and I'll even say, I don't even know if those folks wouldn't be offered a job within the FSB in one of their organizations. But what's interesting, and I think what's been most interesting, so the message you see on the side there, that warning, the warning was from the Conti ransomware group that was published shortly after the war started. They basically said, if anyone from a cyber perspective targets Russia or Russian speaking, whatever, they would strike back. What's interesting about that, though, is because of the fact that a lot of these organizations that were, again, Eastern European ransomware gangs, they had members that were from Russia, members that were from the Ukraine, members that were from, maybe Belarus or what have you. The Ukrainians who were parts of these groups really started just kind of flipping the table and basically saying, like, look, you're invading our country. We're going to toss all this out. And so there's been a lot of leaks of data. There has been a lot of, I'd say, a lower activity of cybercrime coming post, this war. And even from a Conti ransomware gang perspective, there was a security researcher out of Ukraine who leaked roughly 2 years of their internal chats. Brian Krebs, if you guys aren't familiar with him, he runs a blog called Krebs on Security. And anyone who wants to, I think my contact information is in my bio. Reach out to me if there's anything that I talked about that you're more interested in. But he runs a fantastic blog, and he did a 4-part series on what he has learned from reading through really 2 years of the Conti ransomware group's chat logs. And a lot of that ties to how they run their business, what it was like to work there, maybe other interests they have. At one point, they wanted to start their own cryptocurrency. And because they saw a lot of value there. So there was a lot of information that has been leaked. Again, the war is definitely impacting this. It's unclear how long that will take effect, but that's been sort of the takeaway from that. The other thing that I would recommend for anyone who is interested in the Russia-Ukraine cyber war and just some history, there's a phenomenal book called Sandworm that goes back to sort of the 2017 cyber threat of Emotet that was released from that. And just so I said it, I think the biggest risk that we have seen from a Russia-Ukraine factor, the thing that we're most concerned about at SecureWorks, so we've seen some of the wiper malware, we have detections for things like that. But the biggest risk, I think, is the same risk that we saw in 2017, which is some kind of a cyber weapon or cyber tool gets deployed specifically to target Ukraine. But instead, it gets sort of leaked into the world. And in my view, I sort of see this a lot like maybe when man discovered fire. I wonder how many forests were burnt down because we didn't understand how to control the tools that we had at the time. I think we've seen historically things like Stuxnet or Emotet or some of the other ransomware or software tools, cybersecurity tools that have been meant to be very, very targeted. They sort of always leak. And so that's, I think, the big concern. The other big concern, of course, is that Russia decides to truly start targeting, the West from a cyber perspective. We actually haven't seen that yet. And so I think, again, that's a good thing, and I hope it stays that way. The idea at least from, and this isn't necessarily me talking, but the leaders that I have within SecureWorks believe that Russia sees that as too much of a risk in escalating tensions with the West, and they don't want to do that. But things change day to day. So that's really it. But in terms of what I had, I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have. Yeah, that's it. Thank you guys. I really appreciate the attention.
Thank you, Noel. And again, if you do have any questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A and we'll ask those. I did have one question already for you, Noel, though. Do you have any particular recommendation for or against paying a ransom if you happen to be in that situation? And if so, why or why not?
Yeah, so I think it depends. There are organizations that you can work with. So SecureWorks, just so I said it, when we do incident response, we don't get involved in the negotiation of ransomware payments, things like that. We're really focused more on the technical, more on the recovery. But it really depends on your situation. Like many things, it's an it depends answer. So question first is, how good are your backups? Did the data get exfiltrated? What kind of brand loss will you experience? What's the loss of recognition you would experience? What if they did get data? How much of it did they get, and what did they get? And if you can't answer those questions, you probably didn't have the right controls in place in the first place. But it really depends on all of those factors. But again, if all they did was encrypt your drives and you have good backups, and you can figure out how they got into your environment and shut that down, it might make sense to not pay it. But again, I think that's something where having an organization you work with from an incident response perspective who can really help you understand what happened, that's the most important thing to be able to make that decision.
All right. Another question that came in is, when we are talking about the war in Ukraine, and what does SecureWorks see as the biggest risk from a cyber perspective?
Yeah, it's just kind of what we were just talking about, which is something going to leak? Is some kind of targeted, something that is intended to be targeted to Ukraine? Does it leak? There are many organizations, and the big recommendation we have, just as an example, if you have, and hopefully no one in this call has this, but if you have, some kind of an affiliate or some kind of a technical connection to an organization in Ukraine, we would absolutely recommend treating that with zero trust at this point. And if at all possible, just completely isolating them off, making them go in through an environment that has no connection to your environment, air gapping yourself as much as you can from that, so that something like that's not possible. But that's really the biggest risk. And or, as I mentioned, if Russia starts to take the gloves off, I think we've seen over the last couple of years that there is, I'll say it this way, there's work to do within the United States to harden our defenses from a cyber perspective, just across all verticals, all sizes of business, things like that. And it's a big challenge.
We have another question that came in. Somebody said that they saw a similar webinar and described a case where the ransomware was answered from a private Gmail. And they were quoted a low ransom and figured it must be because the ransom group did not really know who they had caught. Do you recommend using a private, recently created Gmail to interact with ransomers?
Again, I wouldn't recommend anything. I would recommend working with an incident response organization to make sure that you know what happened, and they will advise you on that.
Are there any other questions? Seeing none, thank you so much, Noel, for your time today. Great presentation. I know that there's more to learn all the time in this arena, but we appreciate your time. And thank you to everyone who joined us today.